Have you ever felt like something was deeply wrong with the way things are done around you, but everyone else seemed perfectly content to go along with it? Maybe you've sat in a church service and felt more entertained than transformed. Or perhaps you've watched people chase after popularity and applause, while genuine spiritual depth seems to disappear. That uncomfortable feeling in your chest, that whisper telling you this isn't what God intended, that might not be rebellion against God at all. It might be rebellion for God. Most people think being a good Christian means going along with the crowd, never making waves, and always fitting in with what everyone else is doing. But what if I told you that sometimes God calls us to be rebels? Not rebels against Him, but rebels against the very systems and attitudes that keep us from truly knowing Him. This isn't about being difficult or contrary for its own sake. This is about understanding that there are moments when the most spiritual thing you can do is refuse to conform to what everyone else accepts as normal. The great spiritual writer A.W. Tozer understood this better than most. He lived through times when the church was becoming increasingly comfortable with mediocrity, when entertainment was slowly replacing worship, and when knowing about God was being mistaken for actually knowing God. Tozer saw that sometimes the most faithful thing a believer can do is stand against the tide of popular opinion, even when that tide is flowing through the church itself. He knew that God doesn't want us to be comfortable conformists who never question anything, never dig deeper, and never challenge the status quo when it conflicts with spiritual truth. Think about it this way. Every great spiritual awakening in history began with someone who refused to accept things as they were. Every reformation started with people who said, "This isn't right, and I won't pretend it is anymore." These weren't rebels against God. They were rebels for God, standing against human traditions and comfortable compromises that were keeping people from experiencing the real presence and power of the divine. But here's what makes this so challenging. It's often easier to go along with what everyone else is doing than to stand up and say something's wrong. It's comfortable to blend in, to avoid the awkward conversations, to let others do the thinking for us. Yet sometimes God calls us to be uncomfortable, to question what we've always accepted, and to pursue something deeper and more authentic than what the crowd is satisfied with. Today we're going to explore 3 specific moments when being a rebel isn't just acceptable. It's actually what God wants from us. These aren't random acts of defiance, but carefully considered responses to situations where conformity would actually take us away from God rather than toward Him. If you've ever felt that nudge in your spirit, telling you something wasn't quite right, even when everyone else seemed fine with it, then what we're about to discuss might just change how you view your relationship with God and your responsibility to live authentically in a world that often settles for spiritual superficiality. Throughout history, there have been moments when the most spiritual people were considered the most rebellious by their contemporaries. They refused to accept watered-down versions of faith, entertainment masquerading as worship, or human approval taking the place of divine approval. These spiritual rebels understood something that many of us have forgotten. Sometimes love for God requires us to resist the very things that claim to represent Him. A.W. Tozer lived during a time when this kind of spiritual rebellion was desperately needed. He watched as churches became more concerned with numbers than with the presence of God, more focused on programs than on prayer, more interested in what people wanted to hear than what they needed to hear. He saw entertainment creeping into worship, popularity replacing holiness, and activity substituting for actual spiritual depth. In response, he became what many would call a rebel, but he was rebelling against the things that were pulling people away from genuine encounter with the divine. The problem Tozer identified then has only gotten worse in our time. We live in an era where spiritual entertainment is often mistaken for spiritual experience, where being busy for God is confused with being close to God, and where the approval of crowds is sought more eagerly than the approval of the Almighty. We've created systems and structures that can function quite well without the actual presence of God. And we've become so accustomed to this that we don't even notice what's missing anymore. But some people do notice. They sit in services and feel empty despite all the activity around them. They participate in programs and sense something crucial is absent. They go through the motions of religious life and know deep down that there has to be more than this. These people aren't spiritual troublemakers. They're spiritual seekers who refuse to be satisfied with substitutes for the real thing. This is where spiritual rebellion becomes not just acceptable but necessary. When the systems and structures that are supposed to lead us to God actually keep us from Him. When popularity and entertainment replace the pursuit of holiness. When we're so busy doing things for God that we never spend time with God. These are the moments when love for the divine requires us to step back and say, "This isn't working, and I'm not going to pretend it is anymore." The first time rebellion becomes God's will is when religious entertainment begins to replace genuine worship. Look around and you'll see this everywhere. Services that feel more like concerts than encounters with the holy. Messages designed to make people feel good rather than to transform their hearts. Programs that prioritize excitement over examination, emotion over devotion, and audience satisfaction over divine approval. Tozer saw this happening in his day and refused to go along with it. He understood that there's a fundamental difference between being entertained by religious performance and being transformed by genuine encounter with God. Entertainment focuses on the audience and their enjoyment. Worship focuses on God and His worthiness. Entertainment seeks to please people. Worship seeks to please the divine. Entertainment can be controlled and predicted. True worship involves surrender and often surprise. When you're sitting in a service and everything feels designed to generate an emotional response rather than a spiritual one, when the focus seems to be on the performance rather than the presence of God, when you leave feeling like you've been to a show rather than a sacred encounter, that's when rebellion becomes holy. Not rebellion that causes division or hurt, but rebellion that quietly refuses to mistake the counterfeit for the real thing. This kind of rebellion might mean seeking out places and times where genuine worship can happen. It might mean being willing to appear less enthusiastic about things that generate excitement but produce no real spiritual fruit. It might mean asking uncomfortable questions about whether what we're doing is actually drawing us closer to God or just making us feel good about ourselves. The second moment when rebellion becomes God's will is when the pursuit of popularity begins to replace the pursuit of holiness. This happens when churches and individuals become more concerned with being liked than with being faithful, more focused on growing numbers than on growing in spiritual depth, more interested in avoiding offense than in speaking truth. Tozer understood that there's an inverse relationship between popularity and spiritual depth. The deeper you go with God, the more you realize how different His ways are from the world's ways. The more you understand His holiness, the more you see the compromise in systems that prioritize human approval over divine approval. The closer you get to the heart of God, the more you realize that following Him often means walking away from the crowd. This doesn't mean being intentionally unpopular or difficult. It means being willing to be unpopular when popularity would require compromising what you know to be true. It means being willing to be misunderstood when being understood would require diluting the message. It means being willing to be rejected by people when being accepted would require rejecting what God has shown you. Think about the spiritual leaders you most respect. Chances are, they weren't the most popular people in their time. They were the ones who spoke truth, even when it was uncomfortable, who pursued God even when it cost them, who refused to compromise their convictions for the sake of keeping everyone happy. They understood that seeking God's approval sometimes means being willing to lose human approval. This kind of rebellion shows up in small ways and large ways. It might mean refusing to participate in conversations that tear other people down, even when everyone else is doing it. It might mean being honest about your struggles when everyone else is pretending to have it all together. It might mean asking hard questions about whether the choices being made really honor God, even when asking those questions makes you seem like you're not a team player. The third time rebellion becomes God's will is when religious activity begins to replace actual relationship with God. This is perhaps the most subtle and dangerous form of conformity because it looks so spiritual on the surface. People are busy, engaged, involved in all sorts of religious work. They're serving on committees, attending meetings, participating in programs. But all this activity can become a substitute for the very thing it's supposed to produce, genuine intimacy with the divine. Tozer called this the difference between working for God and walking with God. Working for God focuses on what we do. Walking with God focuses on who we're becoming. Working for God can be measured and evaluated. Walking with God requires faith and trust. Working for God can make us feel important and needed. Walking with God makes us feel humble and dependent. When you find yourself so busy with religious activities that you don't have time for prayer, when you're so involved in serving others that you're not spending time being served by God, when you're so focused on doing good things that you're not taking time to be transformed by the good one, that's when rebellion becomes necessary. This kind of rebellion might mean saying no to some good opportunities so you can say yes to what's most important. It might mean stepping back from some activities so you can step deeper into relationship. It might mean being willing to be seen as less committed to the organization so you can be more committed to the one the organization is supposed to serve. The practical application of this spiritual rebellion begins with learning to distinguish between what looks spiritual and what actually is spiritual. This requires developing what TOZER called spiritual discernment, the ability to sense the difference between human energy and divine presence, between religious performance and authentic worship, between activity and intimacy. Start by examining your own spiritual life. Are you busy with religious activities but struggling to find time for simple prayer and scripture reading? Are you more comfortable talking about God than talking to God? Are you more concerned with what others think about your spiritual life than with what God thinks about it? These aren't accusations, they're invitations to honest self-examination. Learn to recognize the difference between being entertained and being transformed. Entertainment leaves you feeling good temporarily but doesn't change you permanently. Transformation might be less immediately exciting, but produces lasting change in your character and your relationship with God. Entertainment focuses on your experience. Transformation focuses on your growth. Practice saying no to things that look spiritual but don't actually draw you closer to God. This might mean declining invitations to events that are more about social networking than spiritual growth. It might mean stepping back from activities that keep you busy but don't keep you close to the heart of God. It might mean choosing depth over breadth, quality over quantity, substance over style. Develop the courage to ask hard questions about the spiritual environments you're part of. Is this place helping people encounter God, or just keeping them entertained? Are the messages challenging people to grow, or just making them feel good? Is there room for genuine spiritual struggle and growth, or is everyone expected to pretend they have it all figured out? Cultivate relationships with people who value spiritual depth over spiritual performance. Find others who are willing to be honest about their struggles, who prioritize growth over image, who are more concerned with pleasing God than pleasing people. These relationships will support you when you need to make difficult choices about spiritual conformity. Create space in your life for genuine worship and prayer. This means protecting time for silence, for reading scripture slowly and thoughtfully, for honest conversation with God about your real life and real struggles. It means being willing to sit with God even when nothing exciting happens, even when you don't feel particularly inspired, even when it seems like everyone else is having more dramatic spiritual experiences. Remember that spiritual rebellion isn't about being difficult or contrary for its own sake. It's about loving God enough to resist the things that keep you from Him, even when those things are popular, comfortable, or widely accepted. It's about being willing to be misunderstood by people in order to be understood by God. It's about choosing the narrow path even when the broad path seems easier and more crowded. The goal isn't to become a spiritual troublemaker, but to become a spiritual truth seeker who refuses to be satisfied with substitutes for the real thing. Sometimes this will put you at odds with popular opinion. Sometimes it will require you to stand alone when everyone else is going along with the crowd. Sometimes it will mean being labeled as difficult or rebellious when you're actually trying to be faithful. But here's what TOZER understood and what we need to remember. God doesn't want comfortable conformists who never question anything, never dig deeper, and never challenge the status quo when it conflicts with spiritual truth. He wants people who love Him enough to seek Him, even when that seeking requires them to go against the grain of popular religious culture. This doesn't mean being judgmental toward others who make different choices. It means being honest about your own calling and courageous enough to follow it even when it's inconvenient. It means being willing to be different when being the same would compromise your integrity. It means understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable spiritual mediocrity by your participation in it. The church and the world need people who are willing to be rebels for God rather than conformists for comfort. We need people who value his approval more than human applause, who seek his presence more than religious entertainment, who pursue his character more than spiritual activity. We need people who are willing to ask hard questions, make difficult choices, and stand for truth even when it's unpopular. This isn't about being perfect or having it all figured out. It's about being honest about the difference between what we've settled for and what God actually offers. It's about being willing to pursue depth even when others are satisfied with surface-level spirituality. It's about understanding that rebellion against spiritual mediocrity is actually an act of love for the God who deserves so much more than our leftovers and our half-hearted efforts. The world is full of people who are quietly desperate for something real, something genuine, something that actually transforms their lives rather than just entertaining them for an hour or two. They're tired of spiritual programs that promise much but deliver little. They're weary of religious activities that keep them busy but don't make them holy. They're hungry for authentic encounters with the divine that actually change who they are rather than just how they feel. When you choose to be a rebel for God rather than a conformist for comfort, you become a beacon of hope for these people. You show them that it's possible to pursue depth in a shallow world, to seek substance in a superficial culture, to hunger for God in a time when many have lost their spiritual appetite. You demonstrate that faith can be more than just another form of entertainment, that worship can be more than just another social activity, that following God can be more than just another lifestyle choice. As we close, remember that every great spiritual movement in history began with individuals who refused to accept the status quo when it conflicted with spiritual truth. These weren't troublemakers or rebels without a cause. They were people who loved God enough to resist the things that were keeping them and others from experiencing His presence and power. The question isn't whether you'll ever need to be rebellious in your spiritual life. The question is whether you'll have the courage to rebel when the situation calls for it, whether you'll be willing to stand for truth even when it's unpopular, whether you'll choose depth over superficiality even when depth is more demanding. God doesn't want conformists who never question anything and never grow beyond where they are. He wants rebels who love Him enough to resist anything that keeps them from Him, even when that resistance requires them to go against the grain of popular opinion. He wants people who value His approval more than human applause, who seek His presence more than religious entertainment, who pursue His character more than spiritual activity. The choice is yours. You can continue to go along with spiritual mediocrity, accepting substitutes for the real thing. Or you can choose to be a rebel for God, pursuing authentic spiritual depth regardless of what others think. You can blend in with the crowd that's satisfied with spiritual entertainment. Or you can stand out as someone who insists on genuine encounter with the divine. The world needs more rebels like this, people who refuse to settle for less than God's best, who won't accept counterfeits when the real thing is available, who love God enough to resist anything that keeps them from Him. Will you be one of them?